Now, for those of you who have been following me for a while, you know that back in 2014, I predicted that the Ukraine war would happen in 2022. Now, I don't say that to toot my own horn, although, but instead to underline that that was only one of three major global military campaigns that I saw shaping this decade. This graphic has the other two. It's an oil flows graphic. So any country that has, let me back up. The yellow bars are total energy demand within each individual country. The green bars are net oil exports. The red bars are net oil imports. And you'll notice that the green bars and the red bars on the whole are inconveniently far apart. Right now, most tankers going from the Persian Gulf to Northeast Asia follow this purple line that follows the coast. Based on where you start and where you finish, that's 5,000 to 7,000 miles long. In a scenario where things in East Asia get a little punchy, the Americans do a trade embargo, the Chinese go for Taiwan or anything in between, the Chinese have the military capacity with multiple weapon systems to interrupt that purple flow line, which means in the case of war, the purple flow line won't be used. Instead, tankers will use this longer flow line that's deep sea. It's an extra 4,000 miles, but it avoids most of the weapon systems of most of the countries in play. The Chinese only have one weapon system that could reach that. They need satellite eyes on the target in order to hit the targets at that range. And the Chinese have no capacity for space combat, whereas Japan and the United States in particular have excessive abilities. So, in a post-globalized world, you should expect one of two things, or two of two things. Number one, things in the Persian Gulf get a little dicey without the Americans there to hold the Saudis and the Iranians apart. That puts half of all global maritime oil flows in the crosshairs. And then number two, you get a naval war in East Asia for any number of reasons. If oil flows use the green line instead of the purple line, the Chinese are screwed. They can't access that at all. But Japan has a fully blue water navy even without its partnership with the United States, and those flows can be convoyed and protected. So whether it's because of demographics or political collapse in China or an energy conflict, the Chinese don't have a candle to hold up to this wind. We're going to see the end of the Chinese system within a decade, one way or another. All right, let's talk about the Russians. First, the map on the left, you're looking at the Russian space. The green zone, that's the Russian wheat belt. That's where everybody lives. The blue and the yellow are tundra and taigai for the blue and desert for the yellow, completely economically worthless. The problem the Russians have always had, however, is the beige. Territories that are flat, that are easy to invade through, but economically worthless, so there's no point in the Russians developing them. There's just too much territory for the Russians to guard. So the Russian strategy has always been to advance to a series of geographic barriers that you can't run a panzer division through, and then concentrate their relatively technologically inept forces in the access points between to prevent invasions from ever reaching in. Russia's been invaded 50-odd times in its history, and almost without exception, the only times that the foreigners have been ejected has been because of bad weather. It's very, very rare that the Russians on the ground have actually been the deciding factor when it comes to what the foreigners do. So from the Russian point of view, it's not just that Ukraine is some of the best land in the former Soviet Union. It's on the way to two of these most important access points, one in Poland, one in Romania. So the Russians were always going to try this. And when they're done with Ukraine, they're always going to push further. People forget that this is not the first post-Soviet war. It's the 9th. And all 9 of them were instigated by Moscow. This isn't Putin. This isn't Putin's current elite and cabal. This is Russian policy going back over 300 years. This war was always going to happen. And the demographic pyramid gives you an idea of why it had to happen about now. That big gouge in the 20-somethings, those are the children who were born in the post-Soviet collapse. That's the last generation of Russia. Now, if you look down into the red zone, like the teenagers, especially 5 to 15, it looks like it gets bigger. It does by the official data, but about 15 years ago, when this number started to boost out, that's when the Russians stopped reporting how they were collecting the data, and a lot of circumstantial evidence from within Russia suggests that they just stopped collecting the data altogether and just started making it up, and that made their birth rate look better. Well, you should probably consider that big gouge in the 20s to be not just the last accurate data, but that probably drops straight down, meaning that roughly a third of the children in Russia just don't exist. So this is the last generation that the Russians have to even attempt to solve their territorial issues with military means. And so they are. All right, let's talk about where we are in the conflict right now. On the left, you have a population density map. On the right, you've got a transport map, mostly road, the dotted lines are rail. The areas that matter are actually not in Ukraine. This empty zone is the Arkansas Desert. It's about the size of Utah. Nobody lives there. There's no infrastructure there. Here's the problem the Russians have. This arc is populated Russia, and it allows access not just to eastern Ukraine, but all the way down into the northern Caucasus, which is a territory that is most assuredly not populated in a majority sense by Russians. This is the land of the Dagestanis, the Chechens, the Agayevs, and so on. You'll notice that for the most part, the infrastructure follows the population patterns as you'd expect. So Russian control of the northern Caucasus is predicated on the concept of Russian control of eastern Ukraine. There's only one transport route of size that is an exception to that. It's the blue M4 line that is highlighted on the infrastructure map. Now, the most important places in the war are these two population centers. In the north, that's Belgorod. That's the city that served as the logistical and support hub for Russian activities in northern Ukraine, including the siege of Kiev and Kharkiv. And in the south, you have the city of Rostov-on-Don, which is not only a massive transit point for energy and agricultural shipments out of Russia, it's the only logistical and support hub for the entirety of Russian operations in the Donbass and especially the Crimea. If you remember the Kerch Strait Bridge, everything that goes over the bridge comes from Rostov. And of course, everything with the Donbass fighting as well. The problem the Russians have is if they lose control of Rostov, this war is over because they can't get forces into Ukraine. But if they lose control of Rostov-on-Don, they also lose control of the northern Caucasus. So a couple things to keep in mind here. Let's assume that, for argument's sake, the Ukrainians are wildly successful with the current counteroffensive, and they actually drive the Russians completely out of their territory by the end of the summer. Let's just assume that that happens. The Russians aren't going to stop. They see this accurately as a war for their existential survival. If they don't pacify Ukraine and the lands beyond in this conflict, then they will have a completely unmoored defensive strategy that has insufficient troops over the long run. And while I don't think the Germans are going to march into Russia anytime soon, this is the last chance the Russians have to get a more defensible perimeter. They will push until they can't, which means Ukraine, one way or another, has to end up in Rostov. They have to break up that logistical capacity so that the Russians cannot even try. And if they do that, Russia starts to dissolve because it loses control of not just its Ukrainian frontier, but its Caucasian one as well. So this last weekend when we had the Wagner coup, which we can talk about that as much as you guys want to, Wagner made its temporary headquarters the logistical hub of Rostov-on-Don. And for several days, all logistical and ammo support and fuel shipments to the entirety of the Russian front stopped. And the Ukrainians are taking advantage of that interruption right